The glass doors of the luxury car dealership swung open, and an elderly man shuffled in. His clothes were worn, faded jeans and an old flannel shirt that looked like they had seen better days. His shoes were dusty, scuffed from years of use. His white hair was messy, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles, evidence of a long and weary life. He looked out of place amidst the gleaming luxury cars and the sleek, polished showroom. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Whispers echoed. Did he get lost? Probably looking for the bus stop. He can't possibly afford anything here. Behind the counter, a young salesman in a crisp suit leaned over to his colleague. Check out that bum. What's he doing here? He sneered. His colleague chuckled, shaking his head, must be confused. This isn't a thrift store. The elderly man's eyes sparkled with curiosity as he walked slowly, taking in the shiny sports cars and the grand luxury sedans. He moved with care, his frail fingers gently touching the side of a sleek, red convertible. Immediately, the young salesman rushed over, his eyes cold, his smile fake. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a condescending tone, "are you lost?" The old man looked up, his face kind, his voice soft. "No, I'm not lost. I was wondering if I could see this car." The salesman's eyes flicked over the old man's worn-out clothes and his dusty shoes. He couldn't hide his contempt. "Sir, this is the most expensive car in our showroom. It's way out of your budget." The elderly man's smile didn't fade. "I understand. But I'd like to see it." The salesman's fake smile grew tighter. "Look, old man," he snapped, his patience running thin, "this place isn't for people like you. Maybe you should try somewhere cheaper." A few customers nearby snickered, whispering to each other. The old man's face softened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded and turned to leave. As he walked away, his shoulders hunched, the young salesman called out with a mocking laugh. "Don't forget to check the price tags at the thrift store." The old man paused, his back turned, his face hidden from view. For a moment, his fingers clenched into a fist. But then he relaxed, letting out a quiet sigh. A faint, mysterious smile played on his lips as he walked out the door. The young salesman scoffed, turning to his colleague. "Pathetic. Can you believe the nerve of some people?" But the old man didn't look back. His steps were slow, steady, purposeful. He knew something they didn't. Something that would change everything, in just a matter of minutes. The man's name was Thomas Gallagher. But to most people, he was just the old man in shabby clothes. Thomas grew up in a small, forgotten town on the edge of nowhere. His father worked in a dusty factory, inhaling toxic fumes day after day, earning barely enough to keep food on the table. His mother took in sewing jobs, working late into the night under the dim light of a flickering lamp. Money was always tight. Food was often scarce. But love? Love was abundant. Thomas's parents taught him the value of hard work and honesty. They taught him that respect was earned by character, not by wealth or status. Even as a child, Thomas understood the dignity in simplicity. He wore hand-me-down clothes, patched and mended until they were threadbare. His shoes had holes, letting the dust and cold seep in, but he never complained. He knew his parents were doing the best they could. Despite their poverty, they were rich in values. His mother always said, "Never look down on anyone unless you're helping them up." Those words stayed with Thomas, echoing in his heart throughout his life. But life was unforgiving. When Thomas was just 14, his father fell ill from years of breathing factory dust. The medical bills piled up, and his father grew weaker by the day. Eventually, he he passed away, leaving Thomas as the man of the house. With no money for school, Thomas worked odd jobs, washing cars, cleaning shops, even shining shoes on the street. He did whatever it took to support his mother and younger sister. He worked from sunrise to sunset, his hands blistered, his back aching, but his resolve unbroken. He was determined to change his fate, to break free from the chains of poverty, to give his family a better life. Every night, after exhausting days of work, Thomas would sneak into the local library. He would sit on the cold floor, reading books by the dim light of a dusty lamp. Books about business, finance, and success. He taught himself everything he could, from accounting to investment strategies. His hunger for knowledge was insatiable. He believed that education was his ticket to a better life. And he was right. By the time he was in his 20s, Thomas had saved enough to start his own small business. It was just a humble shop selling tools and hardware. But through perseverance and honesty, his reputation grew. People trusted him because he was fair, never and always giving the best service. His business thrived. He expanded to more stores, then ventured into real estate and investments. Every decision was calculated, every risk carefully weighed. And over the years, Thomas quietly amassed a fortune. A fortune large enough to buy that luxury car dealership he was humiliated in, if he wanted to. But wealth didn't change him. He continued living simply, wearing the same worn-out clothes, driving an old, reliable car. He never flaunted his riches. Because to him, money was just a tool to help others, not to show off. He donated to orphanages, funded schools in poor communities, and helped struggling families. But he did it all anonymously, never seeking praise or recognition. Thomas Gallagher became a millionaire, not just in money, but in values and principles. He was rich in character, kindness, and humility. Yet, despite all his success, the world still saw him as just an old man in shabby clothes. But he never cared. He never needed their approval. Because he knew his worth. And soon, the arrogant salesman would know it too. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the gleaming luxury cars parked in front of the dealership. Polished to perfection, they sparkled like jewels under the sunlight, reflecting wealth and status. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant, scented with expensive cologne and leather polish. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, illuminating the marble floors that shone like mirrors. Salesmen in tailored suits stood by, their smiles practiced, their eyes sharp, ready to pounce on wealthy customers. But no one paid any attention to the elderly man in worn-out clothes who shuffled in quietly. Thomas Gallagher moved slowly, his gaze drifting over the luxurious cars. His eyes sparkled with curiosity as he admired the sleek curves and elegant designs. His fingers gently brushed against the polished surface of a silver sports car, feeling the smooth, cold metal. But his presence didn't go unnoticed. Across the showroom, a young salesman named Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, check out the hobo who just walked in," he whispered to his colleague, Ryan, who glanced up and laughed. "What's he doing here? Looking for spare change under the seats?" They watched as Thomas continued to explore the showroom, his face lit up with fascination. Ethan's eyes narrowed with disdain. "He's just wasting our time," he muttered. "I'll go deal with him." With a confident stride, Ethan approached Thomas, his expression cold and condescending. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Can I help you?" Thomas looked up, his face kind and gentle. "Yes, I was hoping to see the luxury models. Particularly that red convertible over there." He pointed to the most expensive car in the showroom, a sleek, scarlet beauty that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. Ethan's eyes flicked over Thomas's faded jeans and dusty shoes. His lips curled into a sneer. "Sir, that car is very expensive. Are you sure it's within your budget?" Thomas's smile never wavered. "I'd just like to take a look." Ethan rolled his eyes, crossing his arms. "That model starts at $500,000. And that's just the base version. It's not exactly affordable." His voice was laced with sarcasm. Thomas's eyes sparkled with interest. "$500,000, you say? Must be quite a car. May I see the interior?" Ethan's patience was wearing thin. He glanced around, noticing the other salesmen watching with amused smiles. He didn't want to look foolish in front of his colleagues. With a sigh of annoyance, he gestured toward the car. "Fine. Take a look. But don't touch anything. We don't want fingerprints on the leather." Thomas nodded gratefully and moved towards the convertible. His eyes widened with admiration as he took in the elegant dashboard, the handcrafted leather seats, the state-of-the-art controls. He gently leaned in to get a closer look at the steering wheel, his fingers hovering above the fine stitching. Behind him, Ethan watched with growing irritation. "Don't get too close, old man. You break it, you buy it." Thomas turned around, his face calm, his voice steady. "It's beautiful craftsmanship. Really quite remarkable." Ethan scoffed, leaning against the car casually. "Yeah, well, beauty comes with a price. One I don't think you can afford." He looked Thomas up and down, his eyes filled with contempt. Thomas simply smiled. He didn't argue, didn't explain. He just looked at Ethan with a kindness that the young man didn't understand. Ethan's arrogance grew. He crossed his arms, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of other customers. "Look, old man, this isn't some public museum. If you're done window shopping, maybe you should leave. We don't entertain spectators." A few customers nearby chuckled, their eyes flicking between Thomas's humble appearance and the gleaming luxury cars. One woman whispered to her husband, "Why is he even here? He looks like he can't afford a bicycle." Thomas heard every word, but his face remained calm. He nodded politely to Ethan. "Thank you for showing me the car. I appreciate your time." Ethan's jaw dropped. He had expected the old man to argue, to make excuses. But instead, Thomas simply turned and walked towards the exit, his steps slow, steady, dignified. As he reached the door, Ethan called out mockingly, "Hey! There's a used car lot down the street. Maybe you'll find something more suitable." Laughter echoed around the showroom. Thomas paused at the door, his back still turned. For a moment, his shoulders seemed to sag, weighed down by the humiliation. But then he straightened, his head held high. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Ethan's. There was no anger in his gaze. Only calmness, and a hint of something else, something that Ethan couldn't read. Then Thomas walked out, the glass doors closing behind him. The laughter faded. Ethan smirked, satisfied with his victory. "Good riddance," he muttered, turning back to his colleagues. Waste of time. But as the sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, none of them realized that this was just the beginning. And that the old man in shabby clothes was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. As the glass doors of the luxury dealership closed behind him, Thomas walked slowly, his steps measured and purposeful. His face was calm, his eyes serene, but his mind was already at work. He knew exactly what he was going to do. Thomas pulled out his phone, the screen old and slightly cracked, but still functional. He dialed a number, waiting as the line rang. "Hello, Mr. Gallagher. It's been a while. How can I assist you today?" The voice on the other end was warm and respectful, the voice of David, the owner of another luxury car dealership across town. A man who understood that wealth wasn't always worn on the outside. "David," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm, "I'd like to purchase some cars today. Can you show me the best models you have?" "Of course, sir. It would be an honor. When can I expect you?" Thomas looked at his reflection in the showroom glass, his old, dusty clothes staring back at him. "Give me 30 minutes. He hung up and walked towards the bus stop, his steps unhurried. People glanced at him as they passed, some with pity, others with amusement. But Thomas didn't care. He had never been one to seek approval. Not when he was a poor boy with holes in his shoes. Not now, as a millionaire in worn-out clothes. 30 minutes later, Thomas walked into David's dealership. The atmosphere was just as luxurious as the first place: crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and polished cars that sparkled like diamonds. But the feeling was different. Here, the staff greeted him with warm smiles and respectful nods. No one judged him by his clothes. No one looked at him with contempt. David himself walked over, his face lighting up as he saw Thomas. "Mr. Gallagher, it's an honor to have you here. How can I assist you today?" Thomas smiled, his eyes twinkling. "I need some cars. Luxury ones. Top of the line. And I need them delivered today." David's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly composed himself. "Of course, sir. How many are we talking about?" "3, Thomas replied calmly. "One in red, one in black, and one in silver. The best models you have." David didn't question him. He didn't ask if Thomas could afford them. He didn't judge him by his appearance. He simply nodded, his voice respectful. "Right away, Mr. Gallagher." As the paperwork was being prepared, David offered Thomas a seat in his office and a cup of tea. They chatted like old friends, laughing and reminiscing about the past. It turned out that David's father and Thomas had once been business partners, long before David took over the family dealership. That was why David knew who Thomas truly was, a man of great wealth and even greater humility. The paperwork was completed swiftly, and Thomas pulled out his checkbook. He wrote the amount without hesitation, the pen gliding smoothly over the paper. 3 luxury cars. Paid in full. In cash. David watched in amazement, shaking his head with a smile. "You always surprise me, Mr. Gallagher." Thomas just chuckled, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "There's one more thing I need from you, David." "Anything, sir. Just name it." Thomas leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I want these cars delivered to another dealership across town. Today. Within the next 2 hours." David's eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised. "Their dealership?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Yes. And make sure the delivery is grand. I want everyone to see it." Thomas's face was calm, his voice even. "Oh, and one last detail. Leave a note on the windshield of each car." David leaned in, curious. "What should the note say?" Thomas's lips curled into a smile, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Just right, never judge a book by its cover." The beggar. David's laughter echoed through the office. "You really know how to teach a lesson, Mr. Gallagher." Thomas just smiled, his eyes warm but firm. "It's not about revenge, David. It's about teaching respect. Some people need to learn that wealth isn't measured by clothes or appearance. David nodded, admiration shining in his eyes. That's why I respect you, sir. You're a rare man in this world. 2 hours later, at the dealership where Thomas had been humiliated, the young salesman Ethan was laughing with his colleagues. They were still joking about the old beggar who thought he could afford a luxury car. Then the doors swung open, and 3 brand new luxury cars were driven into the showroom. Red, black, silver. The most expensive models in the entire lineup. Ethan's jaw dropped. His eyes widened as he watched the delivery men park the cars right in the center of the showroom. Customers gathered around, admiring the stunning vehicles, their eyes filled with envy and admiration. The owner of the dealership rushed out, his face glowing with excitement. "Who bought these beauties?" he asked, his voice breathless. One of the delivery men handed him the notes left on each windshield. The owner read them aloud, his voice echoing through the showroom. "Never judge a book by its cover." The beggar. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Ethan, who stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth open in shock. Realization dawned on him. The old man. The beggar. He was the one who bought these cars. Ethan felt his legs weaken, his heart pounding in his chest. He remembered the man's kind eyes, his calm smile. He remembered how he had mocked him, humiliated him, judged him by his clothes. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. He had insulted a millionaire. A man richer than he could ever dream of becoming. His colleagues stared at him, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. The owner's face turned dark with anger. "Do you realize what you've done?" he hissed, his voice low and furious. Ethan could only stand there, speechless, his face burning with humiliation. The laughter he had once shared with his colleagues was now replaced by silence. Cold, heavy, humiliating silence. And outside the dealership, hidden from view, Thomas stood by the sidewalk, watching quietly. A faint smile played on his lips as he turned and walked away. His lesson had been delivered. Not in anger. Not in revenge. But with dignity, humility, and wisdom. The world had judged him by his clothes. But he knew his worth. And now, so did they. Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the showroom, his face pale as the realization sank in. The man he had humiliated was no beggar. He was a millionaire. A millionaire who could buy the entire dealership if he wanted to. The laughter he had shared with his colleagues now echoed mockingly in his mind. He remembered every word he had spoken to the old man, the sarcasm, the insults, the arrogance. It all came rushing back, hitting him like a cold wave of shame. The dealership owner's face was a mixture of fury and disbelief. His eyes blazed as he turned to Ethan, his voice low and cold. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, his mind blank. He had no excuse. "You insulted one of the wealthiest men in this city," the owner continued, his voice trembling with anger. "A man who could have bought these cars, or even this dealership, without blinking an eye." The other salesmen stood in stunned silence, their faces pale. None of them dared to look Ethan in the eye. The customers who had witnessed the scene whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with judgment and disdain. Ethan felt his cheeks burn with humiliation. He wanted to disappear, to run away, but his feet were glued to the floor. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The dealership owner took a deep breath, his face hardening. "You made this business look like a joke. You humiliated a customer, no, a man of dignity and honor." He shook his head, his eyes cold. "There's no place for people like you in my company." The words were like a slap to Ethan's face. He felt his heart drop, his chest tighten. He knew what was coming next. "You're fired." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Ethan's shoulders sagged, his head bowed. He had no defense, no justification. He had judged a man by his clothes. He had mocked him, humiliated him, and laughed at his expense. And now, he was paying the price. The owner turned to the other staff, his voice firm. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. In this business, we respect every customer. Rich or poor, young or old, well-dressed or not, every person deserves dignity and respect." His eyes swept over the stunned faces of his employees. "I don't care if they look like they can't afford a bicycle. It's not our job to judge. It's our job to serve with honor and respect." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He had failed. Not just as a salesman, but as a human being. He had let arrogance blind him, letting pride dictate his actions. The owner's face softened, his voice quieter now. "But it's not just about losing a sale. It's about losing respect. Losing humanity. And that is the greatest loss of all." Ethan felt tears sting his eyes. His pride was shattered. His ego crushed. But more than that, his heart ached with regret. He had met a man of true wealth. Not just in money, but in character, humility, and wisdom. And he had been too blind to see it. Without another word, Ethan walked towards the door, his steps heavy, his head bowed. The faces of his colleagues blurred as he passed, their eyes filled with pity and disappointment. The laughter he had once shared with them was now replaced by silence. He pushed open the glass doors, stepping into the harsh sunlight. The air was cold against his skin, but his face burned with shame. He walked down the street, his heart heavy, his mind replaying every moment of his failure. Meanwhile, inside the dealership, the owner shook his head, his face weary. Turning to his staff, he said softly, "That man, that beggar, he taught us all a lesson today. A lesson about humility. About respect. About the true measure of wealth." His eyes grew distant, his voice thoughtful. "We may sell luxury cars, but it's dignity and honor that make us truly rich." Back at the other dealership, David watched as his staff prepared the final delivery details. He couldn't help but smile, shaking his head in admiration. Only Thomas Gallagher could teach a lesson like that. In his office, Thomas sat quietly, sipping his tea. His face was calm, his eyes serene. There was no anger, no malice, no desire for revenge. He had not set out to humiliate Ethan. He had simply wanted to teach him a lesson in respect, dignity, and humility. He thought of his mother's words. "Never look down on anyone unless you're helping them up." He had lived by those words his entire life. He had built his empire on honesty, integrity, and respect for all people. And he knew that wealth was measured not by money, but by character. Thomas placed his teacup down, a faint smile on his lips. Ethan had learned his lesson. And Thomas had kept his dignity. He stood up, his movements slow but graceful. He picked up his old, dusty coat and slipped it on, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric. Clothes didn't define a man. Character did. He walked out of the office, his steps slow and steady. He passed by the showroom, his eyes drifting over the luxury cars. Beautiful, elegant, expensive. But they meant nothing to him. As he stepped outside, the sun bathed him in golden light. His shadow stretched long across the pavement, tall and dignified. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. He had taught a lesson today. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with wisdom and grace. He walked down the street, his head held high, his heart light. The world had judged him by his clothes. But he knew his worth. And now, so did they. The lesson was complete. The story was told. And Thomas Gallagher walked away, richer than any millionaire. For he was wealthy in dignity, wisdom, and honor. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the city as Thomas walked away, his steps slow but steady. His figure grew smaller in the distance, but his impact remained immense. He had taught a lesson without anger, without revenge, but with dignity and wisdom. A lesson that echoed through the walls of the luxury dealership long after he had left. Ethan stood by the glass doors, his reflection staring back at him, broken, humbled, ashamed. He watched Thomas disappear down the street, his heart heavy with regret. In that moment, he understood. He understood that wealth wasn't measured by clothes, cars, or money. It was measured by character, by dignity, by respect. He had seen a millionaire in rags. And he had seen himself, a poor man in a suit. Thomas Gallagher had changed him. Not with power, not with money, but with wisdom and humility. The showroom was quiet, the laughter gone, replaced by a heavy silence. A silence that carried the weight of a lesson learned. A lesson about judgment. A lesson about respect. A lesson about the true measure of wealth. Thomas didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. He knew his worth. And that was enough. As he walked away, his head held high, his heart light, his mother's words echoed softly in his mind. Never look down on anyone unless you're helping them up. He had lived by those words. And today, he had taught them. The world had judged him by his clothes. But he had shown them his wealth, a wealth far greater than money. A wealth of character, dignity, and honor. And as the sun set, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Thomas Gallagher walked away. A humble man with a millionaire's heart. As we reflect on this story, one question remains. How often do we judge others by their appearance? How many opportunities do we miss because of our own prejudices? This story isn't just about a wealthy man in shabby clothes. It's about respect, humility, and the true measure of wealth. It's about seeing beyond appearances. It's about valuing character over status. It's about learning to look with the heart, not just with the eyes. So, the next time you see someone who doesn't fit the image of wealth or success, remember Thomas Gallagher. Remember that wealth is not in clothes or cars, but in dignity, respect, and honor. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, if it taught you something valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge the way we see the world. And share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance? What did you learn from it? Let's start a conversation. Let's change perspectives. Let's learn to see the wealth of the heart. Thank you for watching. And remember, never judge a book by its cover.